This movie will cover the topic of toxicology, which in your book is chapter 12. Toxicology differs from the drug identification in that toxicology, instead of examining pills and plants and powders, toxicology analyzes body fluids, body tissues, and body organs for the presence of poisons and drugs. The toxicologist's role in Utah is handled by the State Health Department Toxicology Office. It is separate from both medical examiner and crime laboratory and functions as part of the Department of Health. The toxicologist's role is basically a four-faceted job. First, they need to separate the toxic or poisonous substances from the tissue or fluid. Second, they need to determine the identity of the substances in the sample that are pertinent to the examination. Third, they need to determine the quantity or the amount of drugs that are present. And last, but certainly not least, they need to evaluate what that level of that particular drug would mean. Does it mean that they are impaired as drivers? Does it mean that they would be unconscious? Does it mean that that level might have caused their death? This is a very, very difficult assignment in most cases, and sometimes it's not even possible. The most common drug in crime laboratories and in toxicology laboratories is alcohol. Ethyl alcohol, in particular, is the most abused drug in the world. It results in about half of the traffic accidents, half of the traffic deaths, considerable number of domestic violence cases, as well as other violent and active criminal incidents. It is, of course, regulated, and in Utah, we have one of the most strict drunk driving statutes. Our limit for the presumption of impaired driving is 0.05%. Other states have 0.07, which Utah had up until this year, and other states have as high as 0.10. Utah also restricts the purchase of alcoholic beverages stronger than beer only in state-run liquor stores. There certainly is a lot of alcohol brought into the state of Utah, but if you are found in possession of a alcoholic beverage container that doesn't have a Utah stamp on it, you could be prosecuted. So let's talk a little bit about alcohol and about the toxicology of alcohol. It is certainly, as you all know, taken orally as a liquid in many, many, many forms. And almost immediately after you consume it, it is passed into your bloodstream and begins to affect you in numerous ways. Some ways which are traditionally thought actually don't work. Some people think that if you drink alcohol, it will get you warm when you're cold. It won't warm you up. It actually cools you off, but I guess the physical effects make it feel like you were warmer. But in any event, it is absorbed primarily out of the stomach and small intestine, a little bit from the linings of the mouth and the esophagus, but primarily from the stomach and small intestine. Virtually none of it reaches the large intestine, and almost none is excreted in the feces. So the specimens of choice for the toxicology are blood. Blood alcohol levels have been extensively studied, probably more so than any other drug. And so we have a better understanding of what it does at certain levels of the body. And it's commonly accepted that any level of alcohol in your system will result in some impairment. But as far as the driver impairment laws in Utah, if you have a 0.05 or higher, that's a percent, weight per volume percent, higher than 0.05% is considered to be prima facie evidence that you are impaired. So if you have a 0.06 or a 0.07, they don't have to prove that you're driving erratically or dangerously. It's assumed by the court that you are impaired. And of course that makes the prosecution much easier than having to prove that it was the drug that was impairing you. So it's absorbed into the bloodstream, and it's primarily metabolized in the liver. It is also excreted in the kidneys, so the urine contains alcohol. The toxicologists are not happy with the urine samples because there's such a delay in the urine sample. You can drink alcohol, and it can be in your blood for a little while before it starts to accumulate in the urine. And of course, if you don't urinate, if you don't go to the bathroom, then you can have maybe you stopped drinking an hour or so before, and the alcohol level then in the urine would be higher than it would be in the blood. So urine, while it's a potential, and we can certainly determine the urine alcohol level, it's not as reliable nor as often utilized as blood alcohol. Blood alcohol requires the law enforcement officer to have someone who is medically qualified to draw the blood. Occasionally, police officers are trained. Some of them are paramedics. Some of them are trained phlebotomists, but most are not. So once you're arrested for drunk driving or suspected drunk driving, then that requires them to wait while a medical person comes and draws your blood. So police officers don't like that as much. Plus, when it comes court time, whoever drew the blood must come to court to testify, and sometimes they're not available, and it's just another link in the chain of evidence that can complicate matters. And so for this and other reasons, the law enforcement officers much prefer breath alcohol. Breath alcohol is the result of alcohol in your blood circulating through the lungs, and in the deep in the lungs, at the end of the bronchial tubes, there are little dead-end sacs called alveoli. These alveoli are where the exchange of gases takes place. Mostly when we're breathing, then it's carbon dioxide being exhaled and oxygen being inhaled. So if there's alcohol in the blood, then that will have a gas pressure. That will have a tiny amount of alcohol within the air in the alveolus. And so that is what we're attempting to use to determine blood alcohol levels. Many studies have been done, and we can correlate blood alcohol with breath alcohol, and the alcohol level in your body is essentially evenly distributed, including in the brain. So the absolute preferred sample would be brain alcohol, because that's what we're testing, is the effect on the brain. But we've determined that blood alcohol and brain alcohol are the same, so we can use breath alcohol because it correlates perfectly with blood alcohol. So breath alcohol is much less trouble for the law enforcement officer. He merely has a test that he can use, he or she can use in the arrest process. It may be in a mobile unit, or it may be at the police department station. But in any event, the officers can be trained to use the instrument, and therefore don't need to rely on any other source for help as they do with blood. The results are virtually immediate, so they don't have to wait for the sample to be submitted to the toxicology laboratory and wait for results. They know the results virtually as soon as the test is over, and so if they so choose, they can effect an arrest based on the levels of the instrument. The instrument in question is called a toxicology. People continue to refer to it as a breathalyzer. The breathalyzer is an old-fashioned instrument that was used in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and relied on a chemical test, and it was necessary for the operator to break open a couple of little vials, one of which was sulfuric acid, and pour those vials into the instrument. And the instrument had to be reset. If you didn't reset it, then the next test would add to that previous test instead of giving you the results from the immediate one. So there were problems with the breathalyzer. It was, if they were careful and used it right, it was pretty accurate. But the instrument, this toxicology, does not use a chemical reaction in the test. It is in fact an infrared spectrophotometer, and you know what that is now because you listened to my instrumentation lecture and you read that chapter in the book. So the toxicology homes in on two wavelengths that are specific to the spectrum of alcohol, and if your alcohol is present in your blood or in your breath, then it will register on the toxicology. It has a built-in fail-safe mechanism that doesn't allow it to make the kinds of errors that the breathalyzer made. So there's less operator instructions or operator actions that are required. There's no chemicals, there's no dials. The instrument does a pre-test of its own, and when it's ready, it's ready. And the suspect or victim, as you will, just blows into the instrument, and it will run its own test. And it is also designed, because it uses two wavelengths, it's designed to weed out similar chemicals such as acetone or other chemicals that might interfere with the test. What's required is, first of all, the operator has to make sure that you don't have anything in your mouth. And that's, of course, the source of lots of lovely old wives' tales about how you beat the breathalyzer. And it's not even the breathalyzer, and you don't beat it. But it's possible that you could have something in your mouth that would interfere with the test. There are lots of things that have alcohol in them. If you have a shot of alcohol, then you have some in your mouth for a little while, but not very long. And if there are some like pain deadeners that when people have a toothache, they put it in their mouth and it numbs the gum a little bit. But again, those are cleared out of the mouth pretty quickly. So the operator makes sure you don't have anything in your mouth and waits at least 15 minutes. And then make sure that when you breathe into the intoxilizer, that you breathe to the as deep air as you can. So they tell you just keep blowing as long as you can, and that will make sure that you get that air out of the alveolus and not out of your mouth or maybe a burp or something. So that they want to get that deep lung air, they call it, and then the intoxilizer will give you an accurate reading. The reading by the intoxilizer is then multiplied by 2100, which gives you a blood alcohol comparison number. That is, there are 2100 times more alcohol molecules in an equivalent volume of blood than equivalent volume of air. That's a pretty well accepted constant number. Very little controversy about that number. It's pretty fixed and a pretty important number, 2100 to 1. So it's a relatively easy conversion, and the intoxilizer can make that for you. The intoxilizer is the only instrument that's currently accepted for prosecution by the courts in Utah. Other states may have other instruments they use or different rules, but in Utah, the only breath instruments you can use to convict someone of drunk driving is the intoxilizer. And it's a very good instrument and well accepted and is actually monitored regularly by the Utah Highway Patrol. The Utah Highway Patrol has the responsibility for maintaining the breath alcohol program in Utah. So they, certain officers are certified to calibrate and test check the intoxilizers around the state. And they make sure that the instruments are working properly and giving the correct answers. Now, blood alcohol, on the other hand, is lots of blood alcohols are done by the state health department. There are other laboratories that can do that if they get certified, hospital laboratories, etc. But by and large, they use gas chromatography. So they will draw a sample of the blood, which they put into test tubes that have a preservative and a anticoagulant, and that test tube is good for quite a long time if it's properly refrigerated, not frozen, refrigerated. So they then are taken to the laboratory or mailed to the laboratory, and the toxicologist removes a small sample, puts it in a little vial, caps the vial, warms it up to about 34 degrees Celsius, and then, or a little bit higher, and then the gas chromatograph sample is taken from the air above the level of alcohol. So there's a certain amount of gas that has evaporated into the air in the test tube, and that's what they shoot into the gas chromatograph. It's really amazing when you think about it, that they can just sample a little of the air, which you start off with 0.05%, and you just use the air from 0.05%, inject it into the gas chromatograph, and it's sensitive enough to read out levels of breath alcohol. But it's routine, it's accepted, it's accurate, and many studies have been done to compare intoxilizer results with blood alcohol done on instruments, on gas chromatographs, and there's general correlation between those. I don't think anyone now questions the validity of either of those two techniques. Older laboratories may use chemical tests similar to the ones that the breathalyzer uses, but if they're certified, then that's okay. They can do it. But most of them go to the state health department because they're faster and they're equipped to do it and more set up to do it, and so that most of them don't go to the private laboratories or the non state supported laboratories. There are, of course, other instruments and other ways of measuring alcohol levels, which law enforcement utilizes from time to time in situations that don't easily adapt to the bringing a suspect in for testing. There are handheld breath testers, usually operated on the principle of fuel cells, which basically the electricity produced when an organic compound passes through the instrument generates a low electrical charge, which is calibrated by the instrument and is read out as a blood alcohol level. These are convenient instruments, often carried in an officer's belt, smaller than a handgun. So occasionally, if they have a suspect and they don't want to take him to jail, or they don't want to go to the extent of doing the breathalyzer or the intoxilizer, even I say breathalyzer when it's not breathalyzer, so they will just use those instruments, and they're adequate for probable cause purposes, but not for conviction purposes. There are instruments that measure people's alcohol levels that can be incorporated into the electrical system of vehicles, and if you have any blood alcohol, they won't let you start your car. There are some that are in bars and restaurants, so that if you have been drinking alcohol in a cafe or a bar, then you can test yourself to make sure you're under the levels. Nowadays with 0.05, you can't drink very much alcohol and stay under the limit. Of course, the level of blood alcohol varies with size of the individual. The larger you are, the more you can drink and not be illegal. But not very many drinks get you over 0.05. there was a bit of controversy, and still is, I guess, about a level that's as low as it is in Utah. But I guess we're getting used to it, because the law enforcement people say that they have not seen a really big spike in drunk driving arrests as a result. It turns out that they can certainly arrest you with a level lower than 0.05, and you can be convicted. It's a matter of having to prove that you're impaired and that you have some alcohol in your body. And that it's more difficult, but it certainly occurs. Sometimes they will rely on your driving pattern. Sometimes they will rely on field sobriety tests, such as walking a straight line and touching your finger to your nose. And they have a test called nystagmus, which is the twitching of your eye. If you look sideways with your eye and then bring it back, there's a certain amount of twitching, and so they can measure that angle of how far, how big an angle is created at the extreme of the twitch, and that correlates reasonably well with blood alcohol or some other drugs. It doesn't just show alcohol. And there are special trainings for law enforcement officers to learn how to administer that test. I think that it requires a pretty good eye and a pretty good amount of training. I'm not terribly convinced it's all that good, but it is used, and with some success. There are circumstances in which blood alcohol is unreliable. The level of alcohol in the body may increase after death. So if you have a body that's been dead, particularly one that's been dead for a few hours or more, then oftentimes the alternative samples are vitreous humor or spinal fluid. Vitreous humor is the liquid that's inside your eye, and that tends to change much more slowly after death than does blood alcohol levels. There are certainly situations where alcohol is generated in the body even when alive. There are some yeast, Candida for example, which produce alcohol in the body, and occasionally there's a defense is that they didn't drink alcohol, they just had a yeast infection in their digestive tract and generated their own alcohol. But that's pretty rare and doesn't usually work. I wouldn't rely on it if I were you. But in any event, occasionally they use other samples in correlating. So if they take a blood sample and they take a vitreous humor sample and they're the same, then okay, we're happy. But if they're different, then they look at other factors such as time since death and amount of decomposition and so forth and so forth. As far as the law is concerned, if you're driving and you're driving recklessly, too fast, too slow, weaving in and out, et cetera, that certainly is cause for stopping you. And the law enforcement officer then first relies, or most of them first rely on smelling your breath. Actually, alcohol doesn't really have much of a smell, but the beverages that they drink do have a pretty noticeable odor, and I'm sure all of you have been around someone one time or another who's been drinking alcohol, and you could smell what they call alcohol on their breath. And so then they are authorized to ask you to get out of your car based on that probable cause, and then they'll ask you to do the physical tests. If that's indicative of impairment, then they will take you to the station and ask you to do a test. There's a lot of legal precedent, but in Utah, you agree that part of the privilege of driving, you will surrender to a lawful request for an alcohol level test. And if you don't, you can refuse, but you may lose your license, or they may proceed without the test and attempt to prosecute you without it. And in either event, the result is not good. They will oftentimes succeed in getting the prosecution successfully. And in the meantime, you've hired an attorney and spent way more money than the ultimate fine, but maybe you don't want the conviction on your record. So in any event, you don't have a constitutional guarantee that they can't prosecute you by any means without a test. So now let's talk a minute about what happens after the absorption of alcohol. It may take an hour or two sometimes for the concentration level of alcohol to peak after you've stopped drinking or after you've begun drinking. But oftentimes it's 30 minutes or an hour, and blood alcohol level reaches its peak. And it depends a bit on things like other materials that are in your stomach. Starchy, thick material will slow down absorption, and the percent of alcohol in the beverage also affects absorption rates. It turns out that the ideal, if you want the alcohol to absorb the quickest, you should not take 100% alcohol. The ratio of a normal cocktail or a mixed drink is pretty much based on the ideal absorption level. So higher proofs don't necessarily get you high or drunk faster than would ordinary cocktails. Proof, by the way, is 50% of the percent. So 180 proof is 90%. So proof is related to percent, but it isn't itself the percent, it's a ratio. So you eliminate the alcohol, as I said earlier, primarily through the liver by oxidation. So it goes into your blood, and your blood circulates through your liver, and your liver oxidizes the alcohol ultimately to acetic acid, and then acetic acid is further oxidized to carbon dioxide and water. And that's about 95% of the alcohol. The other 5% is accounted for with urine, perspiration, other body fluids and tissues may have alcohol in them as well. So, but the majority, of course, is done in the liver. And the rate of, or the amount of alcohol is decreased over time until ultimately there's no alcohol left in your blood, and that decrease occurs at about 0.015% per hour. So if you had a blood alcohol level of 0.1 in an hour, it would probably go down to 0.085. So if you had a blood alcohol level of 0.2 in an hour, it would go down 0.1%. excuse me, 0.015% times 1, and then you can subtract that from the original level, and so you can extrapolate back somewhat. So occasionally someone who's in an accident and knows that they've been drinking will leave the scene, and they're subsequently caught an hour, 2 or 3 or 4 hours later, and the police think they were driving drunk, so they will take a sample, and then they will attempt to extrapolate using that 0.015% per hour level back to what their level would have been when they were in the accident. That's really difficult because it varies considerably. That's an average. 0.015 is an average, and you have to make sure that you can verify that they haven't been drinking in the interim. So if they leave the scene and drink 5 cans of beer, their level is obviously not going to be down 0.015%. It's going to be up. So it's not a common method to determine what the alcohol level was a few hours prior. It's pretty difficult, although that's the best they've got. So if the sample is not simply an alcohol question, then the drug toxicologist's life is seriously more complicated. There are literally hundreds of compounds that are present in blood and various organ tissues, and the toxicologist must first separate them out. It would seem like a really nice idea if we could just inject the samples into the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer and run the whole gamut of substances from one sample, but the gas chromatograph separation is not universal. Different conditions in the gas chromatograph must be used for different types of compounds. For example, if you are looking for heroin, it goes through the column much slower than amphetamine. So just based on that, we can say that other chemical compounds need to be tested for with specific parameters in the instrument. So first, the toxicologist separates the acid chemicals from the basic chemicals, and then based on presumptive tests, preliminary tests like the color test we've talked about, they have an idea of what we're looking at, or they have an idea of what is normally found in those kinds of situations, and so they can decide what parameters, what temperatures, and what column to use, and so forth, what detection levels are necessary. In any event, they then rely on the results from their instruments to determine an identification and to determine quantitation. How much is there? And it's complicated because, first of all, what goes into the body doesn't necessarily remain the same while it's in the body. We metabolize it, we oxidize it. An example is heroin, which I think I've mentioned before, which is rapidly converted to morphine in the body. So the toxicologist needs to understand the metabolites and how they react and or interfere with their results. There are a number of metabolites of marijuana, for example, that are psychoactive, and a number that are not. And so the toxicologist needs to know which ones are psychoactive and would therefore perhaps interfere or cause impairment, and which ones don't cause impairment, and that may help them to arrive at a conclusion regarding the level of driving impairment of the suspect. And of course, if the sample comes from a dead body, it gets even more complicated with decomposition and formation of new compounds by the decomposition process. Perhaps the most difficult part of toxicology's job is the evaluation part. As an example, the Utah law states that if you are driving under the influence of any substance, you can be arrested for DUI. So if you take Benadryl, for example, for your hay fever or some other legitimate reason, and you take more than is the absolute minimum, you will experience drowsiness. In fact, Benadryl is diphenhydramine, and that is a major ingredient in lots of sleeping aids. So if you are arrested for driving under the influence of Benadryl, the toxicologist will need to testify that the level of diphenhydramine in your system is sufficient to impair your driving. Very few compounds have been studied sufficiently to have good solid numbers for the toxicologist to use. Often they're left with the option of not answering the question, or answering it in such a way that it doesn't really inspire confidence in the jury to believe that they were under the influence, and that's probably right. We shouldn't convict people of driving under the influence of something if we don't know that that's the thing that caused their impaired driving. Lots of times we can drive down the road and maybe we're not paying attention, or maybe we're, heaven forbid, on our cell phones, and for someone following you, it may look like you're driving impaired, when in fact you are. But you're not impaired by any drug, you're impaired by your inattention, or you're just been driving too long and too tired. So the problem with marijuana is particularly acute because we don't have really good solid numbers. We haven't studied marijuana sufficiently to know what level of which of the cannabinoids results in impaired driving. We're pretty sure that at some point, if you have enough marijuana or marijuana metabolite, that your driving will be less than optimal, but we don't exactly know what that level is. And now with the introduction of medical marijuana laws, that compounds the problem, and so we have a lot of people who are legally using marijuana or marijuana's components, cannabinoids, and that will show up in their blood. And so it's a dilemma for the law, and it's a dilemma for the toxicologist who has to testify about it. One number that is pretty well known for many, many compounds is the LD50, meaning lethal dose for 50% of the people. Lots of drugs, we know the LD50, and so if it's over that LD50, then we can assume that they were impaired, and maybe it even resulted in killing them. Homicide by poisoning is a rather rare event, and not many cases come up, but we do have a lot of accidental and environmental poisonings, which are investigated and need to be investigated to make sure that they're not criminal. So most of the most common compound for poisonings is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide, of course, is an odorless gas that's produced by incomplete combustion. Instead of going to carbon dioxide, the lack of oxygen results in carbon monoxide, which is very, very dangerous. It's the result of an improper furnace, the result of burning charcoal, or from automobile exhaust, which is maybe the leading cause of poisons by suicide is inhaling automobile fumes, second, of course, to firearms. But as far as poisons are concerned, that's a really common death, and we already have talked about how to recognize carbon monoxide poisoning. Other poisons, heavy metals, for example, lead, which is a big topic of discussion. Lots of problems associated with lead in our environment. It's a naturally occurring element, of course, but in high concentrations, it can lead to problems, particularly in young, actively growing brains. So toxicologists have those issues to deal with as far as poisons are concerned. One other topic I wanted to deal with is hair. As you're growing your hair, it is, of course, in the root, it is in contact with blood, and so things that are in the blood can get deposited in the root of the hair, and as the hair grows, then whatever it is that's deposited in the root grows out. So hair is a potential source of determining what drugs have been used. It's not an acute answer. We don't find out that someone just barely took drugs or smoked drugs, but we can determine that they have in the recent past. So oftentimes in things like parole hearings or probation hearings, they will request a hair analysis. So if they find marijuana metabolites in the tip of the hair, that may indicate that the person has used marijuana in the past, but not recently. If the reverse is true, that there's drugs down near the base of the hair, the root of the hair, but none out at the tip, that means that they have started using them, maybe started again, or maybe just that's the first time they've used them. But anyway, it gives you some kind of a profile like that. There's a lot of controversy regarding hair, and we have to be very careful how we interpret it. So another little difficult issue for the toxicologist to address